The science of economics has been infected by a virus more devastating than COVID-19. This virus is the Benthamite Virus, the creator of which is Jeremy Bentham, excuse me, Freudian slip. So, who was Jeremy Bentham? Jeremy Bentham was a London scholar. He became a wealthy aristocrat. He was very, the term is prolific, yes. And he had many disciples. They were more like his followers. He was a cheery conversationalist, but he wasn't really open-minded to their ideas. And he believed in enlightened despotism, thinking that if he could get the leaders of the world to see what he sees, then together they can create a society very much similar to a utopia. And at the age of 20, he discovered utilitarianism, which we will go into further. But some of his most notable disciples were James Mill, who was regarded as his Lenin, to Jeremy Bentham being the Karl Marx, and David Ricardo, two classical economists. And being a very prolific writer, Jeremy Bentham had many writings and publications. The first of which he wrote at the age of 28, which was Fragment on Government, which is the ideas of philosophical utilitarianism. However, it wasn't until 1787 that he wrote his first economics works, which was titled Defense of Usury. And the origin of this publication came from a trip Jeremy took to Russia, which his brother Samuel invited him to help establish legal codes for the Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great. In 1786, he heard that William Pitt, the Prime Minister of London, was trying to impose usury laws to drop the legal percent of interest from 5% to 4%, and he wouldn't have this. And at the beginning of Jeremy Bentham's economic career, he was highly influenced by Adam Smith. He considered Adam Smith to be the father of political economy. And he made a very strong case in defense of usury. He said that, first of all, the interest rate is not something that should be regulated by the government, as well as it's up to the freedom of people to be able to contract with each other. He also had valuable insight on capital accumulation, and he said that capital cannot be increased by government decree. As we know, goods exchange for goods. Money cannot create more goods, it can only lower the value of the money itself. And he also had a very valuable insight on time preference, where he said that interest is exchanging present money for future money. Now, a couple years later, he wrote The Rational of Reward, which wasn't published until, I believe, many years later, almost a half century. And the idea was that of this work was that competition is the reward, that people should have unlimited freedom for competition. Getting into 1795, this is where Jeremy Bentham wrote the Manual of Political Economy. And again, he established this idea that you can't have more trade than there is capital. And his works were highly influential. They were translated into French, as well as they were taken to America. And in America, they dropped all their usury laws due to the writings of Jeremy Bentham. So he was a laissez-faire economist for the most part. But in the appendix of Manual of Political Economy, there was a small little input Jeremy Bentham made. And he said, well, there is a situation in which the increase of currency by the government could actually have an effect of fully employing the resources that were not used. And what he meant by this was that if the government utilizes inflation, then these high prices that the capitalist producers are not giving away these products, the products that have been decreed at a higher price could be used by a society if the government were to inflate the money supply so we can bypass these high prices. And what's interesting about this was Keynes used a similar notion of inflation to get around the minimum wage. What Keynes utilized was this idea of differentiating between real wages and nominal wages. And so what he said was, we can raise the minimum wage as well as maintaining inflation if the real wage is not as noticeable as the nominal wage. So people see a higher number on their paycheck thinking, wow, I have more money to buy more goods, but in actuality, the prices adjust. And so you actually have less purchasing power. So it's just a way to bypass people's understanding of money. Anyways, I digress. And then this is where Jeremy Bentham became somewhat of a, as I like to say, inflationista, or a paperista, where he really began to develop the theme that money is the cause of riches. And in his the work after that one, the proposal for the circulation of a new species of paper currency, he said that the government could monopolize all issues of paper notes in the kingdom and issue them out. Bearing that there's no interest on them, the government can save the interest for themselves. And what I want you to take in mind is the dates of these publications, because I will mention these later. That's very interesting. So when questioned about, okay, how far can the government take the inflation? He said, well, the limit would be the amount of paper currency in the country. Now, what as a laissez-faire theorist, you're thinking, well, that makes no sense. That means we could just keep printing money, and that would be the limit. We could just keep expanding the limit. The sky is therefore the limit. And even David Ricardo took pain to this. He refuted this, like, dude, all you're doing is lowering the value of the individual monetary unit when you print more of it. And Jeremy Bentham essentially came to a point where he disregarded all economic laws. He started becoming an ad hoc empiricist, and again, he developed this idea that employment of labor is directly proportional to the quantity of money. He became a mercantilist. In 1801, his paper Mischief Exposed, he said that bank paper should be eliminated. And what should be replacing it is the government monopoly of paper issuing. So there was no more free market for the money market, essentially. In his penultimate work, True Alarm, published in 1801, he really came against deflation. And he said that hoarding money is horrible because there's deflation in prices, production, and profits. But at the same time, he justified luxurious consumption. And he said that luxurious consumption animates production. At this point, Jeremy Bentham was very much anti-laissez-faire economics and property rights. And including his philosophy of utilitarianism, you can begin to see how there is some contradiction. Now, Jeremy Bentham stopped writing on economics in 1804, thank God, but his pure economic writing did not contribute much to anything of the science of economics. However, we get to the Benthamite virus of utilitarianism. So, beginning in the 19th century, economics as its own science really began to be fleshed out and developed. And at the same time, the economists developed something called physics envy. They thought that the natural scientists were very profound and intellectual because they don't make value judgments. They just make their hypotheses, they test it, they come across new information, new knowledge, and it's value-free judgments in a very scientific manner. And this is the whole emphasis that some of these economists tried to adopt, which was how do we make value-free judgments at the same time maintaining a perspective of pure science, becoming scientific. And so what this virus was that if we can somehow imply our desires for public policy into the science of economics, then we can really establish ourselves as something scientific while superficially saying that we're value-free. And so, beginning with personal utilitarianism, this was developed by David Hume, and it is the idea that passions are what drive men to reason to their means of achieving their end goals, their desires. But, however, this is a self-refuting ideology because principles are intersubjective. Principles and ideas can also change the minds of men, and they can develop the influential reasons why people take on certain means to achieve their ends. And I find this very interesting, that this idea that, I will say that in Socialism by Mises, Mises points out that the socialists claim that socialism is simultaneously moral and inevitable. But something that is inevitable is not necessarily moral. And this is kind of what the utilitarians are playing upon, is this idea that your passions, being motivated by your passions, are inevitable. And simultaneously, they're moral if you can hone them into social utilitarianism. So what Bentham developed was this idea that we can remove quality from life. What we can substitute quality with is quantity. If we can impose qualitative analysis into a quantifiable analysis, then we really can develop our superficiality science behind economics. And so what this was called was the philosophic calculus. And what it was a cost-benefit analysis using units of pleasure and units of pain. And he had 7 dimensions, objective dimensions, of what constitutes pleasure and pain. And this, where it gets really contradictory, is the fact that, well, in the science, we have physical objects, and they have linear dimensions, and these 3 linear dimensions can calculate dimensions of volume. And from these units of volume, we can really begin to establish scientific truths. But when it comes to people are not, in their values, they're not autonomous, or as Professor Huerta de Soto says, like penguinos, marching to the orders of the emperor. No. People have their own values, their own choices. These values and emotions cannot be quantifiable. This is where interpersonal marginal utility comparison cannot be made. You can't say that I like Juan more than Vicente by X amount. I can only order them ordinally, not cardinally, not in a numerical value. So, with this foundation of philosophic calculus, Bentham took this and tried to establish social utilitarianism. And so, the idea of social utilitarianism is it can be deduced logically from the if-then statement, that is, if each man tries to maximize pleasure, then the social ethical rule is to seek always the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So what this looks like is completely justifying efficiency in a society over ethical principles. And so the question becomes, well, what if the greatest happiness of the greatest number comes from the greatest misery of the minority? For example, say we all agree that it would make us a lot happier if there were no tall people in this room. Well, maybe we can justify, I don't know, getting rid of them. What does that look like? Well, we got to work that out. But this is the idea that Bentham had of actions cannot be judged on their nature, but on their consequences. Consequences are greater than nature. In other words, the ends justify the means. In other words, you got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. So this is a very similar analysis of justifying communism that Lenin and Stalin had in the Soviet Union. We need to make a new Soviet man. How do we get rid of the people not capable? It's what it is this constrained vision of humanity, which is that people are more or less set in their own ways. There's a certain nature of humanity, and this cannot be changed. When we put people into models, such as Marxism, and it doesn't produce the results we want, well, clearly it's something wrong with the person, not something wrong with the model. And into the meat grinder they go. So again, this idea of efficiency, of happiness, is something very fallacious and very absurd and very dangerous. And what I mean by dangerous is Jeremy Bentham's idea of the panopticon. So remember, I said keep a hold of these dates in your mind. In 1867, when Jeremy Bentham was in Russia visiting his brother created this idea of the panopticon. And Jeremy Bentham thought this was the greatest idea ever. And so he held on to this idea for many years. And I believe, this is my belief, that Jeremy Bentham, thinking that the panopticon is the ideal of perfection, that how do we justify this? Being a laissez-faire Smithian economist, well, this isn't very congruent with the idea of the panopticon. What we need is another justification, an economical justification for the panopticon. And what he produced was his philosophy of utilitarianism, completely maximized through this concept of the panopticon. So what is the panopticon? Panopticon in Greek means all seeing. And what it was a conception of a dome-like structure. And in the center of this structure would be a tower. The tower would be covered with these mirrors that cannot be perceived into. Only from the center of the tower can you observe outward. And Jeremy Bentham was an atheist, but he really admired the concept of God, being a godlike figure. And what he thought of was, well, if we can create a society where people think that they're under the watchful eye at all times, somewhat like God watching on them, we can establish a type of morale in this society that can really get people to do whatever the moral impositions are. So it was this idea of maximum supervision, not only of prisoners, because this would be a prison of some sort, but for school children, which I love how they're side by side. Something like prisoners are very closely comparable to school children. The paupers, the employees, they would all be subjugated to the panopticon. Now, of course, Bentham, a lousy economist, somewhat of an understanding of economics, was concerned with the efficiency of the panopticon. How can we actually implement this and keep the cost to a minimum? Well, he developed many great ideas. He thought that, labor is the greatest privilege or virtue that we can have in society. So let's make everyone work 16 and a half hours a day. At a minimum. Eating is a privilege. Everyone can have their 3 meals, sure, but only 30 minutes of eating a day. We can turn nighttime into sunlight, and instead of beds, we can have hammocks. Instead of sheets, we can use sacks. And his followers thought this was just genius. They thought that all this cost minimization was just perfectly necessary in order to achieve the greatest happiness of the greatest majority of people. What this turned out to be, ideally in practice, was no other than slave labor. And actually, parents who were concerned of the maximum inspection of their children, to Bentham, well, he frankly said, look, call them monks, call them troops, call them whatever you want, I don't care. As long as it maximizes the happiness of all, then this should be something that's justified. As well as the people who were basically captured and thrown into the panopticon would be people who didn't have any property, people who weren't living virtuous lives, whatever that means, and also the children of these people would be entitled to enter the panopticon. There was a contract system in place where if you weren't in the army or the navy, you would be subjugated to the Panopticon. If you weren't being paid annually by someone who technically owned you, I think it's like, I don't know the numerical amount, monetary amount, I think it was 50 pounds a year. I just read in Bitcoin. But anyways, it was like 50 pounds a year that you had to pay to be a free person. So Bentham would be the ones supervising all of this, of course, right? Because who else other than the despot Bentham? And this is, if I haven't made it clear, evil. This is an evil idea. I mean, unless you're the person in the center watching it all, then you're very happy. But if you're one of those people who are born into the Panopticon system, you were in self-isolation. You weren't able to talk because this is for your safety. This is so we don't have a revolution. People trying to leave. So there's no human freedom here. It is people being used as resources, not as human beings with their own values and desires. In the later life, in 1811, King George III denied this idea of the Panopticon, and Bentham was furious. He was frankly quite pissed. Catherine the Great in Russia also rejected this idea of the Panopticon, and he became very bitter. Bentham wrote about it in his later life. He thought this was a plot to overthrow Bentham. He thought that he was so close to having the power of so many people at his fingertips, and it was taken away from him. So what he became was a supporter of radical democracy, or philosophical radicalism. He also thought the words liberty, liberal, were among the most mischievous in the English language because they obscured the genuine issues, which are happiness and security. He thought the state should control everything. H.L. Mencken has the great quote that the average person does not want to be free, they simply want to be safe. And Jeremy Bentham took that to the extreme. He thought not only do people not want freedom and they want to be safe, there is no one in the world who wants to be free. Everyone should obey the law and be safe, subjugated to the state. Lastly, he saw himself as the Newton of the moral world, thinking that if we can transform people into atomistic physical resources, then this is the road to achieving maximum happiness. And frankly, I think he's evil and I think he's wrong. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Comments, questions? Su personaje Bentham. Saben que se hizo momia, ¿sí? Claro. Y está sentado ahí en teoría, creo, ¿no? Sí. Sí. Pensaba él que era muy importante. Sí.
Llevó el panopticon hasta el extremo. Quería ser observado por el resto de la felicidad.
Dice que era el Isaac Newton de la moral, ¿no? En la última frase.
Newton of the moral
world.
Yeah. Great ideas, horrible implementation.
Yeah. So this all drives to the manipulation of society, you know, in the end. At the end of the day, all these ideas comes down to the manipulation of a certain picture of how the society should be.
So what do you think? Do we have the Panopticon already?
Sí.
Why?
Yeah, what do you think about the effective implementations that has been made of the Panopticon? I mean, from the classic company that uses all glass in order to see each other and nobody's lights off, and the China case. I mean, each Chinese person has a mobile phone connected directly to the central government. Are they all as evil as China?
We have a digital passport. they want to.
I mean,
passport, right?
yeah, I mean, yeah, you have here
Well,
as well. Yeah, you
destination
have some kind of
status.
panopticon. I mean, yeah, sure. Between social media and stuff.
To answer your question, I think as far as like the physical exact structure of the panopticon, I don't know, maybe utilizing some prisons, like max security prisons, I'm not sure. But for like the day we live in with the digital panopticon of the digital world, to some degree, yeah, there is some supervision, like your phones, I think listening at all. There was actually, in China, what was it, an app for the Olympics that's going on right now that just records everything. It has access to like your contacts. So China, sure. North Korea, well, you know, in the Soviet Union and in North Korea, these communist countries, you can get turned over by like someone who rats you out, right? So you have that sort of aspect of always being careful of what you say and to who you say it to, because you don't know if this person is going to turn you in. So the trust issues are severe in communist countries, and I'm sure there's not much trust. I mean, there's not much socializing in the panopticon.
But in China, it's not that like they don't have trust issues because they just don't talk about the subjects. But any political subject is considered to be like you're bad mannered.
You're not too much about
You're not
culture.
educated enough. I mean, shut up. That's not something we talk about. You know it.
Mm.
It's like talking to someone about their weight or something like that. It's badly seen. So they don't even have that problem. It just constantly in Big Brother will end.
You don't talk to people about their weight?
No, right, but it's like it might be a sensitive subject. I mean, so
Yeah, definitely.
like you don't go to somebody and say, "Hey, fatty, what's up?" You go like, dude. You don't even say, "Dude, you should consider something." Shut up. You live your life. And in politics with China and politics is the same. Like,
I didn't know that.
what are you talking about, man? Don't be rude. We're trying to have a conversation here. Don't talk about Taiwan.
Yeah.
I mean, it has installed to the point where people systematically and automatically just don't talk about it. They don't even feel observed. It's just that it's rude to talk about it or criticize the government. It's just rude.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is some of a cultural aspect, because I'm sure in North Korea, every day they probably are learning more and more. Like a lot of what they've been told is BS. And there's definitely things that probably more in public social atmospheres, they're like, we just don't talk about that. I think in personal situations amongst closer family members, there's probably more discussion about like what's going on here. Because you know, those people, they're hostages. You would know if you're in the panopticon that you're somewhat of a hostage. And I think at the same time, people of today's world, I mean, probably us more in this room than like your average normie, knows that, yeah, the state is a threat to your life. And I think it's just a difference of perspective of the nature of the state. You know, the most extreme cases being a very totalitarian, authoritative state, which, you know, uses like very violent means to get what they want, compared to states that exist that still have the mask of being there to protect your freedom and your rights. I think it's somewhat of a perspective.
Do you think?
Yeah.
Do you think people are? I know they're aware, most of them, but like, do they really care? Because I mean, China is a bit of an extreme case, but like, remember the Edward
I can't say
Snowden?
most of them care.
But there's none of them care.
You know, Anatomy of the State was translated into Mandarin, I believe. So like, there's some anarchists in China who are like, damn.
Damn, what the hell?
Yeah.
Yeah, but like, remember the Edward Snowden case in the United States, where basically the government admitted that they were spying on all the population, and what happened? They were basically saying that we're kind of like China actually. If you do something that goes directly against the government, we're going to detain you and torture you. And yeah, and people were like, oh, okay, nice.
Yeah. Again, this is a making for. I think it's great. The average person does not want to be free; he simply wants to be safe. Most
They're
people,
wrong.
most people justify like what the government does because they're like, well, you know, they
They just for
justify.
our safety.
But
This ties a little bit in what the quote of Turgot that you showed, right? The idea that when God sees everything, yeah, people behave in a certain way. Or when people believe that there's a God and sees your sins. And then Turgot said this is better than all laws. Right? And here he
Well,
comes
yes,
back
I
and
think
mentions and says,
when
God does
someone-
not exist, but here we have something better.
Well,
We have here the state who looks.
yes, in the essay that I showed you, he said about the belief in God and translated into the tradition and costumbres, costumes. No,
No, should be
costumes on
Traditions are
habits,
Tradition.
tradition.
habits.
or habits.
You know, here we have Bentham that says God does not exist, but here we have something better, which is the state. And now we have the state law and so that everyone really fulfills it, as God does not exist.
Yeah.
Well, we have here the Panopticon, so that
Yeah.
everyone feels observed and feels controlled.
Yes, it's a very similar.
But then he thinks, well, natural law does not exist. The only thing that exists, natural law that comes from God does not exist, but there exists only pleasure, pleasure and happiness and
safety.
the opposite.
Oh, pain?
Yeah, pain. That's the only thing that exists. And then he's the first one who comes up with animal rights, and animal rights exist.
Really?
First one.
Do you have seen the island?
Yeah.
And what?
They
Yeah,
go
yeah.
back.
Which island?
It's a film similar to Panopticon.
Pero es la-
The island.
La isla.
pero es la de Juan McGregor, Scarlett Johansson.
Scarlett Johansson.
It's a movie.
Sí,
Okay, no.
it's similar to that
I
Panopticon.
mean, 1984.
People change the habits because someone see you all time.
Sí, sí, pasa en la isla.
Mhm.
Isn't that the movie, like, they're all home? I mean, spoilers that are...
I think what's also interesting going off that idea of like being seen at all times is the concept of the ego, right? So what stops you from going into a room, seeing the answers to a test, or stealing a cookie from the bakery shop? Well, it's because there's a cost to that. The cost is if you get caught, you may not be back. The cost could be worse than the benefit of obeying the rules. Like you could be kicked out of the school, you could be not allowed into the bakery again. But if you're invisible and you can steal things that you want, and think of all the things you would do. So really what's stopping you is your ego being visible and the cost of the nature that you would have maybe pursued. And when you're being seen from like at all times, there's that pressure to maintain more benefits than what otherwise would be. So I think that's interesting for like the idea of like
It's from you directly. Directamente tú cambias el comportamiento. Va contra la naturaleza.
What about
It's dangerous.
what about central bank digital currency?
Well, I think that look at Canada. They just shut off people's access to their bank's account.
Yeah.
Really, I think if you're the state and you have that power to be like, you know, this guy he was saying something I don't like. Let's just shut his bank account off. I mean, that is again in like the Machiavellian perspective. That is how you rule with an iron fist against your subjects. Is you force them to use the money where you have the ultimate power over. I mean, cash, you can still make transactions off the books, buying drugs, buying animal meat. But if we're going vegan, It's either you're buying the lab meat or you're starving. I don't know.
So this Trudeau guy just canceled the bank account.
Yeah, something like that.
He was threatening to actually freeze all the bank accounts from the people taking part in the
Yes. And now that we are seeing
No.
and people are going to
But the donations.
where other people is withdrawing all the money from
the banks.
their banks. Yes.
Yeah.
There's a big risk of bank run right now. Yeah.
I mean, how can you be so stupid?
It's really bad.
So Bitcoin is coming up in Canada.
It is actually.
This is a very large advertisement.
The solution is cryptocurrency.
Come on, guys. Let's buy Bitcoin.
And Tornado to avoid the.
I mean,
The rust
just
took
these
over.
true colors. No, we serve the people. No, you rule. You rule.
I mean, if you have control of all monetary transactions, it's almost like a panopticon.
Absolutely.
You see,
You can control everything.
people are doing.
And if you do it to shut manifestations, you're literally like killing free speech, killing any critics. You're making a point in history where someone started to all his critics will freeze their bank accounts. It's like, wow.
Yeah, well, what comes before is that, of course, that they freeze your Twitter account.
Right. I mean, yeah. The thing is that they've always been able to do that. They're just showing their true colors now with a serious problem like the pandemic or manifestation against the government. But they with this system, they can always do that at any point. It just takes the right person to just have the courage to say, all to hell, let's freeze everybody's accounts.
What do you think about cameras in the metro?
And in las rosas.
In the metro station,
Ah,
cameras.
Yeah. Horrible.
Are they not to protect you from thieves?
Y en todas en las rozas
And
también.
En las rosas.
Sí, en las calles, en Spring.
there's
En todas las calles.
North
de las rosas.
Madrid.
Sí, es el primer proyecto Panopticon en
Sí.
Madrid.
Well,
Sí.
there it is.
Well, the first justification is because the reason of security, no? To secure.
It's always security for freedom.
Yeah.
I don't think that I have a problem with that.
But
We will fall into the danger.
But would not private police maybe also have cameras?
I agree. I don't have a problem with cameras in the street. It's just who gets to use the cameras. There's no in Pakistan, the streets would be private. So maybe there would be cameras, but they would not be, I guess, publicly owned.
What is the second best one we have to state?
But
That's not second. That's lower on the list. It's not it's so close.
there will always be the temptation for a person into the state to use images against other people.
Yeah, but maybe some crimes are not committed because we have the cameras there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
and if everyone is living in a cage, in their cage, they also are very secure.
Is the place more secure of all Spain? En las rosas. Que es el sitio más seguro de España, en las rosas. No tiene sentido poner cámaras para la
Ah, por
seguridad.
eso, sí. Por eso estoy diciendo que es absurdo. Vamos, que estoy contra las cámaras.
In every street, really.
Busco el artículo y lo comparto.
¿Y que quieren poner cámaras?
No, ya las han puesto.
Y ya están, y van a dotar de policías para el seguimiento continuo. Para
Menos de
proteger.
Madrid.
Bueno, de hecho ahora en todas las carreteras, o prácticamente en todas las carreteras hay cámaras y tampoco nos hemos tirado de los pelos. O sea, es lo mismo pero con personas, pero con los coches ya están. Cada paso para contabilizar los coches que pasan por carreteras y luego que corren al estado son necesarios y están en todos los sitios. Se empieza poco a poco y...
Claro, es que ese es el tema.
En China hay un ranking humano.
Sí, social.
Claro, es que desde una perspectiva del Estado.
Sociópata.
Como Black Mirror.
Sí,
Ah, tengo que firmar.
Uy.
Gracias, yo.